I must admit, when Sean first asked me to be a part of this important event, I was a little bit reluctant. I mean, who can think of standing up and talking about something when you've got such experience, such expertise in the room, and stand in front of these people and never hope to be taken seriously? It's a fear that I retain, but also it's a fear that helped me meld how I wanted to approach you today. I think the opening address last night was a very important one, and it really did address the elements, the core elements of the topic that Sean had given me with respect to poverty. I mean, when you talk about race and class and poverty, you're covering a lot of the same ground. And I think the speakers who have come before me have addressed a lot of those related issues in different ways, the wider harms of drugs. What I wanted to talk to you today in the 14 minutes that I have left is I want to talk to you about the issue of hope. Because as was said last night, we could think of ourselves, perhaps, if I can include myself with you, we could think of ourselves as the first generation of drug policy advocates here in South Africa. We are beginning a process of trying to move towards a wider drug policy that respects the human rights of every person in this country, and to change the way the policies are currently organized such that they harm individuals or they segregate individuals. So we're in this together, and I'd like to do this by telling two stories if I can. So what I'd like to do is to use the experiences from two other countries that I won't name, and to use the experiences of two individuals, speaking of them, not necessarily for them, and speaking of the experiences that they encountered through the process of drug policy reform in their particular country. So I'll introduce you to Huong. Now, Huong's name means fragrance, a strong smell like a flower. Now, Huong was a sex worker. That's how she made her money. She lived on the street for a while. She found a lovely man, got married, had a husband. They were both also heroin injectors. They had a lovely young boy together, and they were living in a country that did not criminalize drug use. Drug use in her country was an administrative offense. Now, what does this mean? This means you don't get arrested and go to court. This means if you're a drug user, the police pick you up and they put you in an administrative detention center. What is an administrative detention center? The country had an entire system of facilities that were de facto prisons that they called detention facilities, where they treated people who used drugs. As an aside, they had a similar structure of systems to treat sex workers. Now, this system had a capacity of about 80,000. The country had about 300,000 people who used drugs, which was a vast underestimate, but that's the number we'll go with. So she lived every day, her and her husband, with the risk of getting picked up and put into one of these facilities. Now, the treatment period was up to 7 years. Now, there was no treatment in these facilities. Treatment was, you were put in the facility, you were detoxified, and you were put to work, fulfilling contracts for international companies, building things that people in Western countries then bought and used. The treatment for sex work, by the way, was only 5 years. Maybe it's easier to cure, I don't know. Now, this was a risk that she lived with, not only being a sex worker and getting arrested for possessing condoms, and then having the risk of being separated from her family and going to the detention facility, but also having to worry about her husband and the risks that he involved. He hustled during the day, she worked during the night, and they made it work. Now, unfortunately, she became HIV positive along with her husband. Seroprevalence rates at the time, this is about 15 years ago, were really quite high. And in fact, they were both what they call triple star. They had HIV, they had Hep C, and they had Hep B. Now, there was no treatment for them at the time because they were using drugs. And this was a health system that prioritized normal people. So if you were a drug user, you were not normal, you could not come here and access services. So this led, obviously, to a lot of problems. And as time went by, thankfully, programs started to evolve and come in. She eventually got onto ART because a program was funded and started through the government to prioritize women and girls. Now, when they say women and girls, what they mean is women and girls who don't use drugs and aren't sex workers, but the other part of the population. She got on ART, her husband didn't, because he was a male drug user, and they would only consider him until his CD4 count got down to 250. And even when it got down to 250, because he was a user, they prioritized other people. And sadly, he passed on due to complications from AIDS. This affected Huong, obviously, enormously, and she decided to begin the process of trying to evoke change in her community. She organized her friends, they got together, and they started a self-help group. That self-help group spawned several other groups. Those groups spawned a community response where they all got together and they decided we would put our own health facility together where we can get service. That facility was then funded and replicated. Now, I must tell you, I'm compressing time here, just for the sake of the story, but also for the sake of the time we have here. That was then replicated in other provinces. This is before social media. The internet was in its infancy. This was communication by voice to friends who talked to friends. This was communication over the phone, fax. Most of you know what a fax is. Maybe some of you don't. Paper through the... anyways. Word spread. And word got through to the government facilities as well, because this was making a change in the community. They started handing out needle syringes when these were illegal. So not only did she risk carrying condoms for her job, but she risked also getting arrested for needle syringes. This led to a significant improvement in the wider living conditions in their community, which was then tried to be replicated in other places. This led to eventually government change. It led to the invocation of OST. It led to the government finally, many years later, to realize that the community-based treatment system they had didn't in fact treat anybody and wasn't any good for anybody. And that OST was in fact a lot better. So instead of having 80,000 spots in these detention facilities, they had 80,000 spots on OST. They put OST in their prisons. They made needle syringe programming nationwide. Now, this may sound rosy. There are still a lot of problems in this country, a lot of things that need to be solved. They're still dealing with this, but this was a process of evolution in drug policy change driven from the community level to the national level that started with effectively a couple of people like Huong. If I can move to somebody else. This is Hyung. Now, Hyung, that name means resilient. It means bamboo, green bamboo that can bend but not break in a strong wind. His name is Hyung. His family grew opium poppy. This is another country. They were reliant on opium poppy for an income. And they would make a couple of $100, maybe $300 a year to support their family. Now, in order to grow opium poppy, you have to pay your local official. You have to rent the land from somebody. You have to pay for protection from the armed groups. And you have to hope that, you have to pay all of this in advance. You have to hope that your poppy is harvested and you get your opium. Inevitably, what happens is the authorities come in and they say, you're doing something illegal here, the same authorities that have been paid off. We must cut it down. And they cut it down, they don't harvest. You run out of money, you get in debt, then you're indebted to them, and it's an ongoing process. So Hyung decided that he would need to get a job to support his family. Hyung went into the mining industry. And as many others who are involved in informal mining, he started using heroin, he started using methamphetamine, whatever it took to get him through his long days that sometimes would be 20, 22 hours. He did what it took. And at the end of every month, like a dutiful son, he would take a 23-hour bus ride back to his village in the mountains, give the money to his family, visit, then go back out and mine again. One day when he returned, he found that his mother was very concerned about his drug use. She was concerned for his health. She was so concerned that she decided that he needed to go into treatment. Now, her community had recently been visited by missionaries who had come to tell them that they had the solution to the drug scourge. The solution was to build a bamboo cage in the forest in which they put Hyung. They left him in the cage to allow the demons to be released from him so that he would no longer be dependent on drugs. Hyung lasted almost 2 weeks. He passed away just before the end of the second week. Now, we don't know the cause of his death, but we suspect it was dehydration. The family quietly buried him and moved him away because they were ashamed. They were ashamed that this man, whose name was Resilience, didn't have the resilience to go through the treatment for the benefit of his family. Now, that story normally would end there, but it got picked up by the international press. It got picked up by advocates and activists in the country because he was not the only one. Many people were suffering these fates. It got picked up to such a degree that it eventually led to change in the organization of drug treatment and access to health care in the country. OST then became available in rural areas. Take-home doses then were allowed for people who couldn't make it to the clinic all the time. Take-home doses were even allowed in the mining communities where they even distributed needle syringes, which was a huge development. And the whole focus of what is drug dependence really started to change in the national discussion. Now, that country still has a long way to go, but this was a significant change in what is a relatively short period of time. Now, what do these stories tell us? What do they tell me? They certainly tell me that the process that we're embarking on here in South Africa is one where there's not one lock and one key to solve the problem. There are many locks and many keys. Maybe we have all the keys, maybe we don't. But the idea is to understand that it's a journey of many steps. It's not going to be solved in a short period of time. It's going to require a lot of pain, a lot of heartache, and unfortunately may also involve death and despair. But it is a process that can and has, in other places, led to success. There is hope. Change can happen. Community is where a community is active and involved and together. Professor Nadelman said last night that the goal, if I can paraphrase, I don't know where he is, the goal is a rational, compassionate drug policy that's grounded in human rights and science. And that should be the goal for all of us, recognizing, of course, as the more, as the speakers before me, and I'm sure many of you in the room know, that there are others who just don't have the same notion of what is evidence, of what is rational, and even, unfortunately, of what is science. Now, 3 years ago, when I first came to South Africa, I did what I try and do in every country when I'm trying to help develop space for dialogue around drug policy and change. I worked together with Sean and Andrew and Harry and several others to organize a meeting here in Cape Town, a meeting of active users who came from 3 different cities. We had the meeting at a very nice hotel on the first day, and I think some of the guests were a little shocked. So we were moved to another hotel on the second day. But we had kits and everything for everybody. But the purpose of this, and what I think is one of the most important processes of any discussion around drug policy, was to involve people who are using drugs in the discussion from the beginning. I have no idea what it is to live a life on the streets. I have no idea of the challenges of using. And I defer to all of my friends on that, and people who maybe say they're not necessarily my friend because I work for UNODC, which is a nasty organization, apparently. But if that is our goal, I think here in South Africa, we've had a wonderful start. Because if I look 3 years back at that meeting, then I look at the meeting that happened last year, which gave birth to the meeting this year, we have more and more people. We have more and more dialogue. We have more and more open discussion on talking about drugs. And for me, that's the beginning of a solution. And that shows me that there's a great deal of hope here in South Africa. Thank you.